Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Mirror Point where reality checks itself. Yeah, today we're going to be talking about theories of mind and in specific emergence. What is emergence? Does it really explain anything? So I'll be playing a few videos, people who have some thoughts on the matter. So let's get right into it. Let's go. Hey, so we're going to be exploring a few videos. I'm going to start off with this one. I don't know who these guys are. I just kind of stumbled across it. And it's just that the guy lays out the question about emergence pretty succinctly. I thought he did a really good job because I watch a lot of videos. I watch a lot of stuff on the topic. And I thought he did a really good job in asking the question, what does emergence really explain, if anything? And yeah, and it kind of inspired, today's topic of the show. So I just thought, the thing about the show here is we question all assumptions, not necessarily pointing people to what they should believe or, anything like that. I mean, we all have our own beliefs about things and worldviews, of course. But I look at metaphysics and these sort of questions as just open questions, things we can compare against each other, like different models compare to each other, just to have the conversation. But I'm ultimately agnostic about it. I have my own leanings, and especially here, I have a big question about emergence as it's described and as it's used. And it sort of directed me towards making my own sort of opinions, and I'll give them at the end, not a problem. But like I said, here it's all about just questioning the assumptions, just let's define our terms and all of that as well. And I'll go ahead and play this video.
Both lay people and scientists, they would say, well, consciousness is an emergent property of matter. Now, what are we to think of this term and what is actually meant, let's say, scientifically speaking, by emergent property?
Well, first of all, if there are such things, and I don't believe there are, but emergent properties would be a brand new kind of property that is totally different than any of the properties that characterize the base from which it emerges. And when the base reaches a certain level of combination and complexity, something entirely new that never existed before appears. So emergent properties are brute facts for which there is no explanation, scientific or otherwise. Because if you could explain why they appeared by appealing to some features of the base, the highly organized base, they would no longer be emergent. You could.
Okay, so emergence is pretty much just a label on a problem, I think. It's a relabeling of a problem, but just considered kind of axiomatic, kind of like a brute fact of reality, sort of like a placeholder term, but it doesn't really, in all honesty, explain anything, according to this person. It's just a description of a thing we see in nature that we can't really explain. That's what I get out of that.
Predict that they would occur based on your knowledge of the underlying base. But one of the characteristics of emergent properties is that they are supposed to be, in principle, unpredictable from an exhaustive knowledge of the underlying base structures. That's why they're literally brand new, and there's nothing about the base that will tell you one way or another that they.
Yeah, they're unpredictable, and so there's surprises. So in other words, emergent properties are another word for nature's little surprises. They come out of nowhere. They come out of nothing. Essentially, they come out of nothing.
Should appear. The only way we learn to anticipate their appearance is by observing repeated times when matter reaches a certain level of complexity and we see the property. All right, but that is only correlating them. It doesn't explain anything whatsoever.
Yeah.
So I think that an appeal to emergent properties is not a solution, it's a name for the problem.
Right. It's a renaming of the problem. It's just that we call this problem emergence. And this is really interesting when you start speaking about things like consciousness. They'll look at you like you're crazy if you don't believe that consciousness was emerged. Like maybe someone believes in a separate soul, like your consciousness is like your soul or your spirit. That's crazy because there's no way you can get that from nothing. Like, how do you explain where this stuff comes from? Fair question. There's no evidence of how these souls, interact with matter or necessarily why we should believe they exist. Well, what about emergent properties? They sort of suffer the same thing. There's no real explanation for how new things just pop out of pre-existing things sort of randomly, it seems like, because it's not predictable. It's only predictable after it's happened and you can observe it over and over. That's a little stronger than the soul stuff, I guess, but I don't know.
It is slapping a name on what is utterly problematic. And here's what's problematic. How can you get something from absolutely nothing by just rearranging the nothing? In other words, if matter is what an ideal chemistry and physics and neuroscience tells us it is utterly bereft of consciousness or the potential for consciousness. Are you
right? So they're saying that if you just connect enough unconscious matter in just the right way, at just the right amount of complexity, consciousness will kick in. It'll pop in. That's the only explanation. And it's because they're basing that on the fact that what's fundamental to consciousness is matter. So they start off with that belief that consciousness is a property of matter, and they explain it through emergence, which has a lot of explaining to do. Like, how does dead matter result in an experience? So, yeah.
telling me that brute matter without any potentiality for consciousness can be rearranged and all of a sudden, presto, this whole new thing that has never existed in the history of the world until the first sentient being evolved pops into existence? No. That's getting something out of nothing. And that problem is why more and more non-theists are moving to panpsychism. And they're abandoning strict physicalism because they acknowledge, like David Chalmers, they acknowledge that if you're a strict physicalist, you're getting something out of nothing, and that's completely impossible.
So he's outlining I don't know if impossible is going a little too far. I mean, how do we know that it's impossible? We just have a hard time explaining it could be the case. I mean, it could be the case that it's impossible. We just don't know. So he's outlining a problem on physicalism, to explain consciousness. Great. And he's going to go into panpsychism. But for me, panpsychism also has a lot of problems too. But let's see what he has to say.
So they've started saying all individual pieces of matter have their own little consciousnesses. These little attenuated, maybe not full-blown, maybe an electron isn't aware it's an electron, but it might have an awareness of attraction towards protons, for example. So then when you bring all of these little pieces of these atoms that have their own individual consciousnesses together, you get the emergent property, because you're not getting something out of nothing. You're getting the actualization of something from potentiality that's already latent within matter.
Okay, so the problem here, though, number one, is going to be, how do you evidence something like that? How can you test for something like that? And it causes some other questions like, how do all these little individuated pieces of proto consciousness just combine together to create this unified experience? This one unified experience of me being a human, although I'm made up of millions, trillions of different proto consciousness. Am I kind of like a hive mind? Like I'm the result of that? Is that what's going on? In that case, when you put, billions of people on the internet together, are they creating a hive mind that has its own individuated, unified form of experience? Like, does the internet have its own experience as an individual? Based on that sort of logic, that would hold, but I don't know if they're really prepared to say that. But anyways, it's got the combination problem and the binding problem. So panpsychism has a few issues of its own. Not that it's not true, but it's got a few issues, as does physicalism. So I wanted to look at biologist Michael Levin to see what he says about physicalism and emergence. Let's see.
Well, so here's the thing with physicalism. Well, let's start with that. I think it's pretty clear to me anyway that important things that serve as causal forces, that are important ingredients in explaining why certain things happen, and in particular in helping you invent new things and control certain events and so on, are not coming from the physical world. And what I mean by that, I don't mean anything too exotic. I mean, well, maybe it's exotic. It's the same thing that Platonist mathematicians. So I'll just give you a very simple example. Imagine in this world where the highest fitness is a triangle of a particular kind. So you have a population of different shapes, and the highest fitness is a very particular kind of triangle. So evolution cranks through a bunch of generations, and you find the first angle, and that's great. And then it cranks through a bunch of other generations, and you find the second angle. Great. Well, now something very magical happens. You don't need to spend time looking for that third angle. Okay, for some reason, you know what the third angle is. You got it. Evolution just saved 1/3 of its effort in searching this thing. Now, so this is not philosophy. This is very practical. You've just saved a bunch of time in evolution. Where did that come from? I mean, as biologists, we love two things. We love environment and we love heredity. So was that part of your heredity, the fact that in the flat space, triangles add up to 180 degrees? Well, not really. Was it part of the environment? Well, not the physical environment. It came from somewhere else. It came from the same place where the distribution of prime numbers comes from, and the truths of number theory, and the fact that NAND gates in computer science are special, and just all these. There's an incredible richness of these patterns. For want of a better word, there are these patterns. And
so
I think
he's saying that mind and all this kind of stuff is the result of patterns instantiated through physical systems. So he doesn't like emergence. He's also showing the problem with physicalism and showing that there's more to it, the story, than just physical matter. There's something else at play that we have a hard time seeing because we're just humans that live in a physical world. So we're not going to see this other thing that he's referring to. And he's talking about a world of patterns or forms, sort of like a Platonic space, although he rejects the classical notions of Platonism. He's referring to a space of possible patterns that get instantiated through evolving structures and systems in our physical reality. Seems like what he's saying. So that's another view. That's another sort of view, but I'll let him continue here.
Extremely well. I think what evolution's actually doing is that by evolving physical bodies, what you're really doing is evolving pointers into this Platonic space of patterns. I think that evolution exploits these free gifts. Here's another example. If evolution discovers a voltage gated ion channel, right? That's a voltage gated current conductance. That's basically a transistor. So you've discovered this protein. Well, automatically you've made a transistor, which means if you have a couple of them, you can make logic gates, which gives you a truth table with some interesting properties. You can do computation. You didn't have to evolve the truth table. You didn't have to evolve any of these properties. If you're a sunflower and you're doing a Fibonacci series, that has some amazing properties. All of those are kind of free gifts as far as the physical world is concerned. But what evolution has to do is to find a way to make a physical object that enables that stuff to. This is a word that Whitehead, I think, used to ingress into the physical world. So all of these truths of mathematics that apparently don't depend on the physical constants of our universe, right? So at the Big Bang, if we reshuffled all the physical constants, all the stuff about the physical world would be different, but these mathematical truths would still be there, these forms.
So it's more fundamental, these mathematical forms, as he called them, that ingress onto structures in our physical reality. Real interesting. So for me, that doesn't explain conscious experience, though. How does that create a conscious experience, though? It seems like it's just kicking the can down the road. Now, for good reasons, but still, how do patterns cause a conscious experience? What is the pattern for conscious experience? That we don't know. Could consciousness just be so fundamental? It's basically a fundamental property. Well, people will say no, consciousness is what the brain does. It's in the brain. It's the processing the brain. It's kind of like just like a monitor. You have a screen on your computer, and that screen is a result of the code and everything, the electricity, the voltage, everything that makes up your computer. It creates that image in the form of pixels. So when you look at it, you see images and things like that. So that's kind of what the mind is. It's just a combination of processes, like a computer. That's usually how it's explained. Well, this opens up a lot of questions still. We can still look at problems on that idea as well if we wanted to. So Alex O'Connor, he's another guy that I like to watch. He's pretty smart guy. So he kind of addresses the issue too. So let's take a listen real quick.
And so I always ask people, well, if I opened up the brain, would I find like a triangle in there? And it's not a sort of perfectly philosophically designed question, but it gets across what I'm trying to say, which is that it seems weird to suggest that the triangle I'm talking about is literally the same thing as the neurons firing. So why can't we just say, like, look, here's a triangle. It's on screen. At least it is if my editor, Alex, is doing his job. And you could ask, where is that triangle? Well, it's kind of, it's in the computer, I suppose. It's like in the phone that you're looking at this picture on, or on the computer or whatever. But the computer's just zeros and ones. So the triangle has emerged from zeros and ones, and that's all consciousness is doing. And the same is true of YouTube, Instagram. These things are sort of presenting themselves as emergent properties of more zeros and ones. But to me, this just doesn't work as an analogy because...
So, yeah, I want to see what he has to say. It already kind of jumps out at me as very a strange argument to make when you think about it. Like, I guess it sounds good on paper, but if you're kind of familiar with the topic enough and you've heard, maybe it just biases you. You hear a lot of different arguments for these type of things, and you're readily easily to spot the problem with it. And it just kind of shows that people who make these sort of arguments haven't really researched a lot of the alternative views. They're mainly just very, literate about their own arguments to support their own views. They understand their arguments, in great detail, but they probably don't know what the rebuttals of those arguments are, because they don't take a lot of time to look at the alternative view. And that's why here, we want to question all assumptions. Like we just questioned physicalism, we just questioned panpsychism. Let's see what he's going to say.
The thing that's weird about the triangle is that there's no screen on which it's being presented. It's as if you had a computer that wasn't plugged into a screen, and yet still there was somehow, in some sense, a triangle. Like, kind of not in the computer, right? Because the computer's just zeros and ones, not projected on a screen for somebody else to come and look at, but just somehow present there. But if it's not in the sort of physical makeup, if the triangle isn't in the computer chip or something, and there's also no computer screen, so there's no triangle on the computer screen, where would that triangle be? Where could that triangle be? Like, you are just closing your eyes and the triangle is just presenting itself right there to you. There is no screen that it's plugged into. So I don't think it's a suitable analogy. And there is also a kind of wider problem with this that I think people don't pay attention to, which is that when we have this problem of consciousness, well, how do we get conscious experience, which seems kind of immaterial? I mean, that triangle in your head, how much does it weigh? Seems like a weird question to ask. But, we're materialists. We believe that the world is made out of stuff. So how do we square this? And people...
Well, I know one thing people do. People just re-identify stuff. Hey, everybody, I'm just playing these videos. Seems to make sense, but the problem is, seems like it could make sense of things that didn't make sense. Many panpsychists people think an electron is conscious seems to go off. Emergence. Yeah, I was just kind of reacting to that. Someone making the panpsychist argument that there's a little bit of proto-consciousness inside of each electron and photon and what have you in nature. And when you just combine those things in just the right way, somehow a unified experience comes about. But they can't tell you how just combining a bunch of little proto-consciousnesses will unify. So we still don't have an answer to the binding problem. It doesn't really explain the combination problem. And so it also inherits problems. I think this is the one thing that about consciousness is that every model that is put forth is always going to have some kind of weird problem to it. And people, depending on, what metaphysic you want to sit on, if it's emergence, you're going to laugh at the folks that put, consciousness first in some kind of way, like panpsychists, or, but they'll ignore their own problems that they haven't addressed. And that was the thing we opened up with. Physicalism also has its own problem. Just this whole idea of emergence itself is a problem, as we're kind of discovering. But anyways, I'm going to keep on going. And hey, Joel, I see you out there, brother.
Just say, yeah, consciousness is emergent of the brain. And then they give an example. They're like, oh, it's just like, an image on a screen emerging from the computer, or it's just like temperature emerging from atoms. I mean, think about the fact that individual atoms are not hot or cold. But if you put them together and they vibrate in a particular way, you get this emergent property of heat, of temperature. Another example is the wetness of water. Individual molecules of water are not wet, but if you put them all together, you get this emergent quality of wetness. And so people don't tend to actually explain like how this process of emergence is supposed to work, in particular with regards to consciousness, but they just say, well, it must be a bit like these other things, which don't seem to be a mystery to us. But here's the thing that no one seems to notice. All of those other examples of emergence that we're comparing consciousness to presuppose the existence of consciousness and rely upon conscious experiences.
Yeah, because you have to be conscious to have an observation of anything. So you're sort of, if you want to use that screen analogy, then you're looking at the screen and saying the stuff inside the screen explains the screen. And that's a little counterintuitive to us. And it's not to say that that could be impossible or should be impossible. I don't know. But if you have to explain it, it's a bit of a challenge, you know.
So take the computer, for example. Yeah, there's a triangle on the screen which emerges from the computer as long as there's someone to see the triangle, right? Like it's something that presents itself to a viewer. You're looking at the triangle. Okay, what about temperature? Well, you've got a bunch of atoms that are vibrating and none of those individual atoms have this thing called temperature. But if you put them together, what do you get? Well, if you take any conscious experience out of the equation, you've just got a big physical object that's vibrating at a particular rate, or at least its atoms are vibrating at a particular rate. Okay, so, you know, what's interesting about that? Well, the thing that's interesting is there's this other quality that emerges called temperature. Well, what's temperature? If you just define temperature as like the average atomic vibration across a particular, you know, space or something, then nothing emerges because, yeah, like individual atoms have an average vibration over a particular space. No, but there's this extra thing. It's the experience that you have when you touch a hot thing.
Right. And that's the very thing that's trying to be explained. And so it just goes on in like a little epistemic loop there. It's it can be really difficult. Because whenever you start with something else to explain something totally opposite than what it is or different than what it is, then you've got what you call a conceptual gap. And that's what happens with physicalism, is unable to bridge that conceptual gap. Now, there's other views that can close the conceptual gap with consciousness, but then it may raise other problems when it comes to explaining matter. So you've got the hard problem of matter, but those things can always have their arguments, and it's up to each and everybody to kind of see what makes more sense to them. It's always kind of a trade-off, but for me, you know, some views have a lot more trade-offs than others, in my own opinion. That's how I see it anyways.
It's a thing called heat, it's a thing called cold. And those things, yeah, they're not there in the sort of atomic makeup of the thing that we're looking at, but they're also phenomenological. They're ways in which we interact with objects. Like, think of that computer, right? Okay, I'm going to put a triangle, or Alex is going to put a triangle again on the screen, right? So you're looking at a triangle right now. You're not really. You're looking at kind of photons that have been emitted from a screen. You're looking at like wavelengths of light that are hitting your eye and being converted and translated into this image of a triangle. Okay, cool. So if you weren't there to look at the triangle, yeah, those wavelengths and those photons would still kind of be there, but I could describe everything that's there in scientific terms. I could just use physics. I could talk about the electricity of the device. I could talk about the way that screens work. I could talk about the emission of photons into the air and all of that kind of stuff. The thing that makes it interesting is that your brain is interpreting that as a triangle. And yeah, when it does that, there's this like new thing that's emerged that.
But where is it? Where is that triangle? If it's not on a screen, it's just the patterns of neurons firing. And that's not what you see. You see triangles, but that triangle is representing the neurons firing in your brain, right? So you kind of can see the triangle, but you see it from a third person point of view, a perspective from the outside. From the outside, that experience looks like a bunch of neurons firing. I guess that's one way you could say it. But from a subjective first person point of view, you're going to see the picture in your head.
Can't just be explained in terms of zeros and ones and the sort of atomic structure of electric devices and photons being emitted from screens and stuff. But the interesting thing that can't be described in those terms, the thing that's actually emerged, in other words, that's like different from the fundamental stuff, is an experience. It's you seeing the triangle. So yeah, imagine like you just had a computer that was not plugged into a screen, and I told you, there's a triangle in that computer. And you said, what do you mean? I don't mean like, oh, there's, you know, some data on the computer. There's like a hard drive, which if you plug it in, there's some information that will represent itself as a triangle on a screen. I mean, like right now, there is, in some real sense, like a triangle with 3 sides in that computer, it'd kind of be like, what do you mean? You might say, oh, I think I see what you're saying. You're telling me that there are zeros and ones on this computer, which when plugged into a screen will produce this image of a triangle on the screen, right? And I say, no. The triangle itself is just like there in the computer. That would just be a really strange thing to say. And it would seem untrue. It seemed like it couldn't be true. And that is what it is like to close your eyes and imagine a triangle. There's no screen on which I'm projecting that image. It's all internal. I mean, the questioner talks about YouTube, for example. If I download a YouTube video onto this phone, and then say I like break the phone so that the screen doesn't work, I can't sort of tap it anymore, I can't even get into it, and I say, there's a YouTube video saved on this phone.
No, there's just information that will cause that video to be represented. And so it's something deeper would be the thing. Let me look at some of the comments. Joel, you say, yeah, but analogies trying to illustrate emergence are not attempts to explain consciousness. Are you sure? Epistemically or ontologically? Are you sure? They're just examples, maybe for you, they're just examples meant to help understand emergence. Well, you can't speak for everybody, because everyone I speak to, and I'll place a bet with you. I'll bet you $1, Joel. I'm supposed to have a discussion with some physicalists here on the Kentucky Atheist channel. And I'll let you know when it comes up. And we're all going to talk about, where does consciousness come from? How much do you want to bet that they're going to say consciousness is an emergent property of the brain? How much do you want to bet that that's what they're going to say? Because that's what they say. Yeah. It should be just a label, because that's all it really is. People should just admit that emergence doesn't explain anything. There's nothing to understand. Emergence is just a label to explain something we don't understand, something that's not predictable. You can't predict when something, that's the whole definition of an emergent property. But anyways, we've got glorious content. My view kind of goes along the lines of, it is what it is, and largely reject practice of metaphysics. The capacity for acquiring data exists because it's useful to us. Yeah, so that's a philosophy. What is it? Functionalism, maybe. We can respect that. A simple Darwinistic viewpoint can explain the arrival of consciousness, if not the emergence. If there is some of emergence problem with matter, that's pretty, that there is some of emergence problem with matter, that's pretty insane. I mean, it should be explained, you know what I mean? Like, all of these things are metaphysics. If you say that you don't want to engage in metaphysics, but then say, well, consciousness comes from nature, that's a metaphysical belief. So you don't think that anything emerges from anything, Scott. I find that a strange view. Didn't say that, Joel. What we're doing here is we're just questioning. We're posing a question. We don't just assume, something exists or doesn't exist. I don't know. Emergence is pretty mysterious, because it just means that, it's something that is a placeholder. It's a word for a mystery. That's all emergence is. It doesn't explain anything. It's just this thing that we see in nature, stuff coming from nothing. That's emergence. That's what it is. And it's just good to admit that's what it is. It's just an observation. We're going to call it emergence, where this stuff comes from nothing. If a question is raised when we answer one must ask, we create information here. The arrival of conscious entities creates information here. If there were no us, the problem wouldn't exist. Okay. Didn't you say emergent doesn't explain anything? It doesn't explain anything. If it does, tell me what it explains. That would be interesting.
That would be true, right? And you would know what I mean. Like, there is a hard drive or an SSD in this phone on which is stored the information of that YouTube video. But I want to be really specific here. It's not that I've got a YouTube video in my hands. What I've got is a hard drive with information which, when plugged into a screen, will display the thing that I am calling a YouTube video. Right? But the video itself, like the imagery, the color pattern, that kind of stuff, is not literally inside of this phone right now. It's something that gets projected by the phone when I plug it into the screen. And so, yeah, you would say, well, of course you're not going to find the YouTube video like literally inside of the phone. No. It's something that kind of emerges like when you plug it into the screen and turn the screen on, and the screen like accesses that information and presents it as like a pixelated image. And that's when you get what you call a YouTube video. But imagine I said, no, the YouTube video itself, like the thing you call a YouTube video, the pixelated image, of a particular sort of size and resolution is like literally inside of this phone right now. That kind of just doesn't make any sense to me. And similarly, the idea that the triangle can exist in the same way in my head just doesn't really make very much sense to me. And yet, there it is, that pesky little triangle. It just won't go away. And that just gives me a lot of pause. And it's interesting, when I talk about this, I find that like half the people I'm speaking to are like, yeah, that is really weird and cool and interesting. And half the people are like, what are you talking about, man? It's just like atoms in your brain. And so maybe you just think that I'm going crazy or something. But the thing I really just want to drill down on and make clear is that when I say the triangle is not in your brain, I don't mean to say that there isn't like neural activity which is correlated with my experience of the triangle. That's there. If I open up your brain, I will see neurons firing in a particular way. I may even be able to prod your brain in a particular way to make you experience a triangle, right? If I knew enough about brain chemistry, I could make the right neurons fire such that you go, whoa, I just saw a triangle. Even then, the neurons that I am like, pushing along are not the same thing as the triangle that you've just experienced. They're correlated, and for some reason that we don't fully understand, or I would say even remotely understand, that neural activity is correlated and seems to somehow bring about that experience. But it's not the same thing as the experience. Just as every time I clap my hands, there's a sound, and it seems to be that my hands cause the sound to occur, me clapping my hands is not the same thing as the sound that sort of vibrates across the room. It's not the same thing as it. It might cause it, and of course in this case we understand how it causes it, but it's not the same thing. So yeah, you can fully explain all of the brain activity that goes along with, correlates with, maybe even somehow causes conscious experience, but that doesn't make them the same thing. And
yeah, it's an identity theory, basically what that is. So anyways, based on what he's saying, the conscious problem could look like a wave particle issue, and some people think you can square related physical question with quantum mechanic experiments. I hear you. A lot of people do that, but it still just kicks the can down the road for me. Because then again, so if you want to say, well, it's not the neurons that cause consciousness, it's the quantum waves. Well, how do they do that? Why should there be a conscious experience correlated with wave particle issues? I mean, it just opens up more questions for me. I can just point back to the examples of Emergent already given by Alex. Do you accept that Emergent describes what's happening here? Of course, emergence is a description. It's a word. That's what words do. They describe things. But I'm saying it's not an explanation. It's like, so I could just ask you, at what point does the mind emerge? Like what combination are we talking about, Joel? What combination of matter, particles, and all that cause the emergence? Like, how does experience come out of dead matter, unconscious matter? Each piece doesn't have any potential to be conscious, yet you put them together and voila, we have consciousness. Can you show me what those ingredients are? If you can't, then you've just got something that could possibly be true, but it's not really explaining anything until we can. That's my whole point. So what is the explanation of temperature? Right. That's a good question. It's not thermometers, though, is it? And I think it's ridiculous when they think that. Ivan the Heathen explains how supposed philosophical implications of quantum mechanics experiments come from cross-contamination of assumptions in the hypothesis and interpretation of the conclusion. Yeah. Joel says, you keep going straight to consciousness and its cause. I'm just trying to get you to focus on emergence. Well, okay. What is it about emergence? So I'm not sure what are you saying? Like, so what does emergence explain? Tell me. No, let me put the link up. Maybe this will be better. Hold on. Get you on, man. It's kind of hard to do all this typing. Because, I'm not really saying that emergence isn't a thing. I'm just acknowledging that there's problems with emergence to explain stuff. That's what the topic is about, and I was pointing that out. Yeah, just jump in when you're ready. We had the one guy was saying that, emergence is just to say that something happens that we don't understand why. And the only reason we can predict it, like, say, wetness, we can predict when wetness will occur is because it's already been observed. But just observing that behavior isn't a metaphysical explanation until you can actually tell me what emergence really is. Or at least solve some of the problems, with the concept itself, because there are problems. I think when we try to say there are no problems with things, it kind of displays that we're sort of embedded in a belief. We don't want to pretend that there is, any question. There's no way you can question. It's kind of dogmatic. You know what I mean? Like, you can't question things like that. Not that Joel's doing that, but a lot of people, I notice they argue in that way. It's just a given. But no one really understands what it is. It's just a placeholder word as far as I can tell. That's where I agree with all the videos that I played. These folks were kind of outlining that. Now, if someone has a better argument, jump right in. I have the link right there. And you can make the case for why emergence is a real thing and explain some of these problems. Maybe we'll pull some of these up. But yeah. Come on, Joel. Come on in, man. All right, here we go. Let's wait till he gets good and connected.
All right, Scott.
Joel, hey, what's up, buddy?
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no worries at all, man. So do you have any questions about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's always worth kind of nailing down what it is we're talking about when we talk about emergence, which is why I think that we can't just shit all over the examples as soon as they get brought up. The examples are there to kind of delineate what it is we mean by emergence, right? So when they get up, like the example, the only one I remember was the temperature one. I think there was at least another one brought up. But neither one of these things was meant to be an explanation of consciousness. But for some reason, even Alex, I think, or at least he started to say something like, you have to kind of be conscious in order to even consider these examples, or at least that's the direction you seem to take it, Scott.
Yeah, but do you understand the argument?
I don't think anybody was saying that temperature is consciousness. So when they talk about temperature emerging from some state of things that's not temperature, like particles that don't have temperature in and of themselves, but when you combine them, they do have a temperature. We're not talking about consciousness. So going to consciousness is just swinging and missing at the actual thing, which is. Mm-hmm.
That was his point, Joel.
But the points. Yeah, and I haven't watched that video from Alex.
Did you catch?
I'm not going to be. No, man. I just kind of tuned in just a few seconds before I said hello.
Okay, so
I didn't catch the very beginning.
Yeah, so let me tell you how the argument was presented. When asked the physicalist, what explains consciousness? And they said consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. That was the answer, right?
Yes, some physicalists posit that. Not all physicalists posit that.
Not all, but all huge. I would say a huge majority. Yeah, would say that.
That's fair.
So anyways, even neuroscientists, come on, they'll say, yes, it's an emergent property of the brain. We already know if you tweak out these neurons and cause them not to fire, you won't have this particular experience, that particular experience, right? That proves it's an emergent property of the brain, right? So
what proves?
That's the argument. So then the first video that I was playing was just outlining that argument and looking for any possible flaws with it. So the possible flaw with it is with the idea of emergence. Like what they'll say, part of the argument, Joel, that they'll say, well, just like wetness comes from H2O, consciousness arises from the same process of emergence. We can't tell you at what blah, 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 but it's probably something, more than likely something like that, right? But
you understand that when they invoke emergence, they're not talking about some kind of specific substance or agent that has to be the same in both cases. If we were just to take two examples of things that emerge, like temperature or wetness, and we would say, well, do we mean, is emergence like the same kind of like stuff in both equations? No, it's not. It refers to the idea that when you start with some stuff, you can get something that wasn't there by combining them, right? So it's not saying the emergence that's happening when you get wetness from H2O is the same process that's happening when you get consciousness from a brain. What they're saying is the similarity there is that in both cases you can get something that wasn't there in the parts. You have to combine the parts in a certain way in order to get that new property. And that's what emergence means. When you take those examples and you treat them as if they're arguments trying to get to consciousness, you're not really, I don't think you're getting the point.
They don't work. They really don't work. And the other thing.
Well, of course they don't work. That's not what they're meant to do.
Well, they can be.
They're just meant to say this is what emergence means when we say something emerges from something else.
I get what you're saying, but I'm saying the people who argue differently, you're saying are wrong. So you're saying the physicalists are wrong to say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain?
Well, I don't know if they're wrong or not. I don't pretend to know that. I do think that's probably the most likely thing that's going on. But again, that's a very low certainty conclusion for me.
So if you point out the problems with emergence, you're saying it doesn't apply with emergence in the brain, though? Only with other.
Well, I didn't hear a problem with emergence pointed out, except to say that, like, hey, when we're looking at the way that temperature comes from, it can become a property of molecules when they are arranged in a certain way that the individual molecules don't have. That there's no problem there. That is a crystal clear example of emergence. Temperature isn't in the parts; it's a product of that emerges from a combination of the parts.
Right. And you're saying that it's possible that consciousness is that thing.
Well, I'm not saying that I know it's possible. I'm just saying I think that's at least as likely and maybe even more likely than a lot of the other things that get posited. I mean, is it more likely or less likely that it's fundamental? I mean, I don't know. How does something become fundamental, Scott?
No one's going to know.
Like you're kind of challenging this idea that something could emerge. Well, okay, then what about the idea that something never emerged, that it was just always existent and never needed any kind of external cause? That's also really weird, right?
But why should I assume emergence is the default?
It's not the default. I'm just saying when you talk about emergence seems funny when you try to imagine getting from something that doesn't have these properties to combining them in a certain way to get to something that has these properties. That seems strange, right? And you're like, well, yeah, except we have lots of examples of that kind of thing happening, where you get a property from some other thing that doesn't have that property once you combine it in a certain way.
It's not strange when it comes to other things, but it's strange when it comes to consciousness.
But it's also strange to say that something is fundamental and never needed a cause, that it just existed outside of time forever and ever, or kind of popped into existence and became the cause of everything else.
Well, that's the whole point that I'm making on the video, is that all of these different worldviews have their own set of problems. But what people generally resonate with depends on the individual, like his priors and everything like that, to go into that.
But Scott,
I'm not really making
the
case. I just want to let you know I'm not making the case that one worldview is superior than the other. That wasn't my whole point. The point is that when you say emergence,
and I didn't hear you saying that.
There may be problems.
I just think that sorry.
I'm just saying it means that there may be problems with emergence too, though.
Well, I don't know about maybe problems. What I think we've looked at is we've said, well, if we're considering the idea that something is emerging, we might have to say, well, we don't know why it's doing that. We don't know why when you put these things together, you get this new property. But again, saying I don't know to me is a good thing. You need to be ready to say it, and it's okay to say it. There are bound to be I don't knows sprinkled into any theory. Like I said, if we started with anything ontologically fundamental and then we asked the question, but why is that the ontologically fundamental thing? I think the honest person would have to say, well, I don't know.
Okay, so when I'm
but again, my main
hold on, Joel.
Yeah, go ahead.
When I'm going to debate the Kentucky atheists here in a few days, and they tell me that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, no question, you're going to disagree with that.
Well, I don't know the Kentucky atheists well enough to know their position, but if you've heard them say that before and you expect them to say it again, they may say it again. I don't know.
So my question, my whole point is just that agnosticism should apply equally across the board.
Well, sure. If you take agnosticism as an attitude about accepting conclusions and withholding judgment in relation to good evidence, then I think it prevents you from accepting a lot of things, or at least, couching them in that kind of very low certainty. Like I said, I try to be honest when I say, well, I really do think that I accept this as true, but I see a lot of reasons to kind of lower my certainty in it, right? So that's how I am towards the idea of brain-based consciousness. Is I think that the evidence points us in that direction, but I also see all the reasons why we could be misled or fooled or just never know the truth.
Right. So do I. And that's what I'm saying. Like when I do this debate, I'm going to be challenged with a positive claim, and my claim is
You're
going to
giving
be
it?
no. But
You're giving the
my
claim?
position is not necessarily to know, but to just point out the problems with their positive claim. So they're going to
Oh, you're
say
responding to their
there are
claim.
no problems with physicalism. There are none.
Mm-hmm.
There are no problems with
Mm-hmm.
materialism. And they're going to say, consciousness, it comes from a brain. It's the emergent property of the brain. It's proven. There's nothing to argue here. So that's their position. And my position is
Okay.
just to say, I don't know if that's true, but I don't believe it because I don't know if that's true. And so we're going to have that sort of debate back and or
But you also
conversation.
want to, your position is to poke holes in the arguments they're giving for it.
Yeah. To show
So here's what I would recommend. Yeah, here's what I would recommend, especially if you're anticipating that their position is that minds emerge from brains. I would let these examples stand for what they are, which is to kind of make it clear what we mean when we say emergence, and don't treat them as if they are arguments for consciousness. They're just arguments. They're not even arguments. They're just illustrations of emergence. Kind of like if we were to take anything. Yeah, well, that seemed to be the way it was getting handled, though.
Yeah, like I view emergence as a real thing. That's why it's got a word to it. It's a real observation in nature. So we really see these patterns emerging. That's a real thing. But there's all kinds of metaphysical, there's all kinds of models to explain emergence. Like there's some people that say, it's just something inherent in nature, like mathematics. Like, if you combine the math in just the right way, emerges this other thing, and it's and it's just, we're looking at it. We're looking at the math in action. Somebody, a physicalist could say that or something. Or
I'm not sure about
God, like a spirit. There's a spirit at work that's just creating stuff out of nothing, and we call that emergence. Other people could say, something like an idealistic thing, or there's so many different things. But just saying emergence,
you could call anything you want emergence. I think the idea of a God creating stuff is not the idea that we're talking about here. We're talking about the idea that when you take a bunch of material, right, and you put it together, you can have emergent properties that were not there in the materials before they were arranged that way. And that's not what's going on when a God creates something, unless it's making it out of materials, which, I mean, you could have a story like that, but...
And I suspect most theists would not want to say they were emergentists. Like, because
creation ex nihilo.
You have that something from nothing problem. Like, if at base level, like, let's talk about emergence in consciousness, for example, that hypothesis. If the base level is entirely unconscious, it's purely physical, and it's fully describable in third person terms, then emergence must explain how first person appears from zero experiential ingredients. So that's the problem that they have. Now, it's not to say that it's not true or anything like that. It's just asking a question that needs to be kind of tied.
Sure.
How does rearranging?
But to be fair, we could
yield experience.
We could just say, we could just say that if we're willing to abandon physicalism and just posit things, we could say, well, no, there's no emergence happening. Maybe just, God, this is the point where God puts the soul in the body. You know what I mean? The thing is that, like, positing those kinds of explanations can solve problems, right? You can solve metaphysical problems by positing this and that. But the question is, as you said, does it just raise more questions about, well, why is the God? Why is the God exist, and why does it do what it's doing? And
And the same with every model, like idealism,
sure.
Non-dualism, whatever. All of these things open up just a different set of questions. Like you're just making a trade-off, and it's for each and everybody to kind of examine a comparison. Maybe that's your approach. It just really depends on what your standards are, and those are ultimately subjective to each and every one of us. We value different things in our metaphysics, our rule set.
Yeah. But I just think in terms of, what we have justifications in believing and what we don't kind of do point us towards the idea of emergence of consciousness, because the things that we're justified in believing in don't go beyond the physical, except for the category of stuff that is our mental experience. And so when we're trying to explain that mental experience, I think it's pretty sensible to say, well, if it was emerging from all this physical stuff that I'm convinced is out there, that would be a pretty sound grounding for it. Even if I didn't know where all this physical stuff came from, why it exists the way it does, even if I don't understand how emergence happens, it does seem to be happening in a lot of examples all around me.
Yeah, but I don't really have an issue with emergence in one category. I just have a problem with category errors and not pointing them out. For example, like emergence definitely explains physical patterns, but not ontology. So like in science, emergence usually means like what? Higher level behavior arising from lower level interactions, right? So this works really good, like we were saying, with temperature from molecule motions, or traffic jams from individual cars, or ant colonies from simple agents, right? But consciousness is not just a pattern of behavior, it's a subjective experience. Emergence only explains what systems do, but not really why experience exists at all. So we still have that problem. And that's the only thing that is that when you start talking about emergence, it's helpful. We see it in physical patterns. But if we're talking about consciousness, how does emergence apply? That's what I'm asking.
Okay, but it sounded like what you just said is, sure, we can look around and see emergence happening in all kinds of examples around us. The only one that you really have a problem with is the example of consciousness, because we can't look around us and find an example of consciousness emerging. But that's just assuming the conclusion is false. If we are in fact having an experience that is emergent from the physical, then we are in fact seeing that example. We're just not able to recognize it. So that's the question we're trying to solve, is we're looking at consciousness and going, what's the answer? And then some people are saying, well, what if it was emergent? You can't say, well, it can't be, because there's no example of that.
No, that's not what I'm saying, Joel.
Sorry.
That's not what I'm saying at all. I tried to stop you about 5 minutes ago. No, I'm not assuming that emergence that consciousness cannot emerge from unconscious matter, because we might live in a magical universe. That might be possible. Anything's possible in a magical universe. You know what I'm saying? So,
well, or just things are the way they are. If that's the way things are, then that's the way things are. It wouldn't need to be magical.
But at the same time, we can always question assumptions and premises and things like that by pointing out the problems. And really the problems are just internal inconsistencies and things like that you can look to. But it's not to say that they're not true. Like I'm not that, I don't have that kind of hubris. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to make it as if you were just standing there kind of denying this thing. What I'm saying is that when you say, well, sure, we have all these examples of emergence, but none of them are examples of consciousness emerging, you're kind of saying, well, there's this one special thing that is consciousness, and we don't know whether it's emerging or not. But that's not the point of the examples. The point of the examples is just to kind of say, this is what we're talking about when we talk about emergence. And it does seem to be something that can happen. If we were to take something like temperature and we would say, well, what if it wasn't really emerging the way we were assuming that it was? What other ways could it be being caused? Well, I have no idea how else you could cause something like temperature. What if we were to talk about something like locomotion as the result of, the parts of an engine in a car all working together to kind of move you down the road? Is the locomotion itself something that you could, find in the parts? No, it's not going to be found in the parts when you take them apart, but it is kind of a very special result that you get from these combinations. And to say, well, consciousness is probably the one thing that you couldn't get, no matter what combination of parts you put together, seems to be like you need to kind of just make that assumption in order to kind of deny at that point that it shouldn't be included. To call it a category error is to say, well, consciousness is special. It belongs in the category of things that cannot emerge. And I just don't see how you're justifying that category assertion.
Well, I mean, you just don't see it. If we knew how that would happen, it wouldn't be an emergent property at all to begin with. So the fact that, you've got AI researchers out here trying to figure out how to make computers, some people talking about how can we make our computers more sentient so they can be better at intelligence, right? And they haven't figured it out. They haven't figured out how to make computers intelligent. Why? Because no one knows. There's no emergent property that we've discovered in nature that explains consciousness at all. So to use that as your evidence seems to be weak, because you're using something that
I didn't invoke that.
I mean, it's okay for philosophy, it's okay for an opinion, but it's not okay for a truth claim, because it's not the truth. We don't know if that's true or not yet.
Yeah, I was saying that the examples that we have of emergence that we accept are not the examples about consciousness. They're just being brought forward to say, this is emergence, this is what we're talking about. Now,
it's an entirely wrong category.
At the point that you suggest the posit that consciousness is an emergent property,
right.
You're not saying,
now, here's another thing
we're not pointing to that out in the world as if it's a foregone conclusion that we have evidence of that. We're either seeing that in the brain or we're not. We can't tell.
But here's the other point that I want to make too, is that it really depends on your beginning assumptions too. Like if I was to go physicalist and agree, okay, let's use physicalism as our frame, then yeah, that makes sense. Emergence, I could see why emergence would be the explanation, the best explanation on the table. But it's really should be just, you should really just say, well, it's the best explanation we can think of, but it's not proven. But it's the best explanation. And you can go into arguing why it's the best explanation on physicalism. But you can't say that that's the best explanation on idealism or on dualistic, like theism or something like that, right? It just depends on your core assumptions going forward.
Yeah, but as I've explained, how I've kind of pointed out that my materialism or physicalism is kind of the softer kind, that it doesn't say there is nothing outside of this category. It just kind of says, hey, other things that I believe in, they're all in this category. And so when you have that, your world model includes those things, and it doesn't include those other things you're just not convinced of.
Right. Well, you should just, when you make your argument, you're just upfront and say, well, I'm operating from my worldview. I'm operating from my version of physicalism. And within that framework, we can examine whether it's internally consistent.
Well, I usually do once we get to that point, but in this case, it was more. I'm just jumping in here, kind of saying, hey, when you get these examples, they're meant to illustrate what emergence is. You know, treating them fairly means treating them as what they are, illustrations, not arguments.
Yeah, of course. They shouldn't be used as arguments. That's the whole point that everybody's making on the videos that I showed, was that Michael Levin said that people really shouldn't use emergence as an argument for explaining consciousness. That's what he said. The first video, the guy.
Okay, but listen, that's a different thing. It sounds like to me.
Well,
that sounds like a different thing than what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that examples are not arguments. I'm saying you can argue for emergence, but the example of, let me give you an example of what I mean when I say emergence, is just an example. It's not an argument.
Mm-hmm. Right. I get it. I get it. And
but someone can posit, you can posit that the brain is, or the mind is an emergent property of the brain. Make an argument for it, fine. But when someone says, well, what do you mean by emerging? And you say, well, let me give you this example, for instance, temperature.
And they always do. They always do.
Of course, because examples are good tools for explaining what we mean.
Yeah, well, they'll say this is how the brain, it's something like this. You put these properties together that are totally different than the property that arises out of it. And they'll say an example.
Yes, it's similar.
The fire analogy and all that. But you can show how these analogies are category errors. That's the point. These analogies,
where do you show that?
They don't fit when it comes to emergence from a brain. They just don't.
Of course they don't. They're different. That's my whole point, is they're different examples. They don't have anything to do with the brain and consciousness. The only similarity is the idea of emergence.
Right. And we get that. So now
okay, you keep addressing it as if the problem is that it doesn't lead to consciousness. It's not an argument for consciousness.
I have yet to hear one. I understand how emergence works, but how does it work in consciousness? I'm waiting.
Well, you have to get past the examples first and say, okay, now we've established what is meant by emergence. If you agree that what's meant by emergence is that you can get a property from a combination of parts that the parts don't have, then someone can point to the brain and say, look at the brain. It has all these parts arranged in this certain way, and it does seem to have that correlation that we all agree is there. It would be explained, that correlation that we see would be explained if it was a causal relationship. And we have nothing else to posit as the cause of mind. So people can either posit, well, mind must be fundamental, or they could posit, well, maybe it's coming from this arrangement of stuff as an emergent property. And I'm just saying, out of the two things, when I look at them from that soft materialist place, which is just saying, I don't believe in consciousness out there somewhere as the cause of mind. Instead, I believe in this thing that I have good reason to exist, my brain. I have good reason to think it exists.
So in your opinion is there's only two possibilities here?
No.
Okay.
No, I was just comparing those two because that's the position I think, broadly that you would maybe fit into. And then one that I would fit into more broadly.
Well, I mean, my views on this kind of lean one way or the other, but I'm sort of like entertaining other ideas always. And there's, that I'm aware of, there's like 4 or 5 different models that we can talk about, not necessarily those two. And they would explain emergence.
I was just going to ask you, would any of them kind of pass that soft materialist test that just says, are they all just appealing to things that we both already believe in, like ourselves and the objects that we interact with? or are they kind of invoking and positing something else that we don't, like a metaphysical back there behind the physical thing?
Yeah, a lot of them do. Some of them are God. Some of them are the idea of a platonic form of some sense, like a pattern in nature
Mm-hmm.
that instantiate itself
Yeah.
upon the physical.
Yeah.
There's also like what do you call it? Neutral monism, which is just to say that there's this mysterious thing we don't know what it is, but it can explain everything. So, but it's all an all natural thing. So it's just some undiscovered natural thing we don't know. There's people that take position, and then there's people that are just agnostic, that just don't give a shit about it one way or the other, and just sort of take this non-dual awareness thing that all I know is that I'm conscious and I'm having, and that's all I care about. That's all that's important. And so they're kind of neutral on ontological claims. I entertain all of it, to be honest with you, Joe. I entertain all of it.
That's
and I
fair.
listen to all of
That's
it,
fair.
and I have to really just think about each one in depth and just try to point out all the problems and holes in each of these ontologies. So
Sure. And I don't mean to shout you down for discussing any of them. I think they're all interesting. I like to hear about all of them. Sometimes when I hear the one that I kind of identify with most, or at least like I do take some of the positions, like like this example of emergence, I'm a little more likely to be like, hey, come on, give it some fair treatment. But I'm probably guilty of doing similar things to other ideas. I think it's always easier to stick up for the ideas we, at least are sympathetic to, if not, actively holding. But yeah. Anyway, good to talk to you today, Scott. I'll probably bounce here in a second, unless you had a.
Oh yeah, man. Just thanks a lot for coming on. I enjoy these kind of conversations and going back and forth to, make us think about stuff even deeper. So I appreciate you always for that.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah,
likewise.
Man. And so I'm gonna probably kill the stream here too, unless someone wants to join. You can jump in if you got any questions or want to talk about it. I've got the link down there. The Stone Philosopher says, is Alex Connor in this live? If not, very misleading thumbnail. I didn't mean to mislead you. I usually just do reaction videos and I put their pictures up and stuff. So I didn't mean to mislead you. Sorry for that. Another one.
All right, I'm gonna back out. Later, y'all.
Okay, man. Have a good one, Joe. Appreciate you, brother. If a viewpoint allows for solipsism, that's so much of reality that's inevitably left unexplained. Yeah, and there's a hard problem of solipsism. Like, how does the solipsist explain surprises? How does he explain consequences and things he can't control? Why is his mind only of himself and he sees others that he can't really control in his mind? These are like the problems of hard solipsism. But there's also really no way to disprove solipsism because it's unfalsifiable. But that in itself becomes a philosophical problem too, unfalsifiability for a lot of people. But yeah, if somebody wants to come on and discuss it, do you know how emergence explains consciousness? Is it proven? Can you prove it? What are the problems with it? Are you an idealist, a non-dualist? Like, do you believe in souls and gods, stuff like that? Does that better explain consciousness? Man, I'd love to hear from you. But if not, I'm going to go ahead and cut it, man, because I've been here for over an hour. And shoot, I'm going to get on out and do some work, and we will catch you on the rebound. Thank you for checking me out.